Hello everybody, my name is Walter, and this is episode 21 of my Redstone Commands Series. In this episode, I want to cover the data command, which is a rather technical command that is primarily used to change NBT data of entities, but can also be quite useful if you're working on a data pack and you need to store some data for later use. Now, the data command is a bidirectional command that allows you on one hand to read the current NBT data of single blocks, entities, or from the NBT storage. But on the other hand, it allows you also to manipulate said NBT data. There is one exception to that, and that is the NBT data of players can only be read with the data command. It can't be changed. If you want to change something about the NBT data of a player, you will need to use more specialized commands, like for example, the item command to manipulate the inventory of a player, as just one example. At this point, you might ask, what is the NBT storage? Well, to put it simple, when you try to store information for later use, you could put it in the NBT data of an entity or a block. The problem with that is that you are rather limited. For one, it's only accessible if the storage, in that case, is in a loaded chunk. And for the other, you can't use custom tags. You can only add NBT tags to that entity that are actually allowed for that entity. So you can, for example, put a powered state, which is something for a creeper, into a spider. Or you can put a custom list called myList in any entity, essentially. And that's where the NBT storage comes into play. This is basically a zipped file that gets saved in a subfolder in your save game directly. And inside of that, you can store data however you want. You can make lists, you can make composites, you can just store numerical values. You are completely free to customize your NBT data however you want. And that's what the NBT storage is about. And with that, let's talk about the different modes of the data command. So the data command has 4 modes. The get mode is the only reading mode, and then we have for changing NBT data, the merge, modify, and remove mode, with the modify mode having 5 sub-modes, 3 that are specifically for working with lists and 2 that are basically for everything else. Before I get to the details, let's quickly talk about a simplification I made in the following pages. When you see target or source, you can replace that with 3 options. The first option is the word block, followed by the position in XYZ coordinates of that block entity. Second alternative is entity as a word, followed by the actual entity, which can be the player name, it can be the unique identifier of that entity, or you can use target selectors here. Careful when you're working with target selectors, you have to limit it to 1. The data command only accepts singular entities as a target or as a source. That's very, very important here. And the last option is the word storage, followed by the name of that storage. This follows the normal namespace convention. So you start, for example, with Minecraft, double point, then the name of the storage, my storage, for example. If you don't add the Minecraft double point, then it's automatically added by the game. But you can also give it a completely different namespace if you want to make sure that no one else is overwriting your information. With that done, let's talk about the actual modes in more detail. The first mode is the get mode for reading the current NBT data of the entity, block, or storage. You start with data and get. Then you specify the target, so which entity you want to read the NBT data from, which can be the block, an entity, or storage. And then optionally, you can further specify which path or which part of the NBT data you want to read. If you don't specify it, you get all the NBT data. If you specify it, you get only part of that. So for example, if you just write pos, then you would get a list that contains the XYZ coordinates of that entity. If you write pos and then in rectangular brackets 1, you would get the second entry of that list since the indices start at 0, which would be the Y coordinate. If you're in a composite NBT tag, then you can go further down by adding a point. So you start at the highest level, then point, then the next level, and so on. And that way you can figure out your way through the entire NBT structure until you are at the point where you want to get to. And the last option is a scaling factor. This only works if the path itself leads to a singular numerical value. If that is the case, you can scale that with a floating point number. Be aware the game will round that result after the multiplication. That's the reading of NBT data. Now let's talk about changing NBT data. The first is pretty much a brute force approach, just overwriting basically the NBT data with what you are giving it, or pressing the new NBT data into the currently existing NBT data, you could say. We start with data and merge. Then again the target, block entity or storage with the specifications of those. And then directly you write what NBT data you want to add or overwrite. So in this instance here, I would add, if it's not already existent, a tag no AI double point true. Be aware again, only if the entity or the block entity is allowed to have the tag, this will actually work. If it's not allowed, you can run the command, but nothing will change. Parts that are not mentioned here, but are already part of the entity will not be affected by this also. So it's not a complete override or hard reset, it's just a addition or a merge. The modify I will cover in the next few pages, so let's get forward to the remove. This is used to remove or reset the NBT data. Here, you start again with data and then remove. Then once more the target, block entity or storage. And then this time not optional, you have to specify the path, for example, no AI. This would remove the no AI tag from the entity or would at least reset it to the default state if the entity is forced to have it. And with that, let's actually get to the modify commands. So I've split this into two parts. The first is working on lists. So we start with data and modify, and then we have three different submodes we can select from. The first is append, which adds the new entry to the end of the given list. The second option is prepend, which adds it at the beginning of the list. And then we have insert with an index following that, which basically adds it at a given point in that list. Again, be aware that the indices start at 0. I will show you an example a bit later. After that, you will specify the target, block, entity, or storage. And then optionally, you specify the path to that list. If you leave it out and your target doesn't have a list at its highest level, the command will not work properly. So in that instance, the path is more or less required, just as a side note here. And then finally, you have to give the command the new value. This can be done in two ways. The first can be directly giving the value. So you write value, and then you actually give the new value you want to add here. So for example, just a number. As I said, I will show you an example later on. Or you can copy it from another NBT data from another entity or even from another part of the NBT data of the same entity. So you write from, then you specify from which entity, block, or storage you want to get it, and then somewhat optionally again, the path. So this can be used to add to an already existing list, either directly or copying it from somewhere else. Second part of modify is data modify and then either merge or set. Merge is more or less, again, merging the NBT data And set is pretty much a hard reset of the NBT data in the given path, if you give it one path. So the merge is just squeeze the new information in there as it fits. And set is, okay, we wipe the entire thing clean and give it new information, more or less. Target follows that again. So we have to again say, okay, which target we have. Target is again block entity of storage. Then somewhat optional again, the path. And as you can see, the rest is similar to before. We can now again give it either directly the value, so value and then the actual value, or we can say from then the source, which can be again block entity or storage, and then following that optionally again the path. So very similar to before, just not working directly on lists. Little warning here, when you're merging lists, you are overwriting the entire list. So merging on lists is pretty much the same as setting, just as a side note. And with that, it's time for the examples. So I've prepared two groups of examples. The first here is working with the storage, and then I have a few examples in the background with some entities. So let's get started. For this, I'm working with a storage Minecraft double point basics, which is a storage I designed myself basically. And the first thing you would want to do is just check if there is such a storage or if there is some information in that storage. So data get and then the storage Minecraft basics. And if I do that, I can see, okay, currently the storage is empty. So there is no information in there. It might not even exist at this point. Next, let's add something to that. So merge is the option we go here. So data merge, again, the storage is a target. And as you can see, I'm adding a list with 4 entries, which are 0, 45, 135, and 180. So some degrees, most likely. So let's do that. You can see we have modified the storage. And if I now look into the storage, you can see that I have the storage now with my list in there. Now you might have noticed that there was something missing. The 90-degree value was missing. So let's add that one. So we start with data, then modify since we want to work on list. We are working on a storage. We are working on that list we just entered. And we want to insert at the third point in the list, basically. And the new value we want to give it is 90 degrees. And if I do that, and now look at the list, you can see, okay, now I have 0, 45, 90, and so on. So I've added a new entry to the list. I can add the same entry again. So let's do this a second time. And you can see now I have 90 degrees twice in there. Yeah, can happen. And with remove, I can remove that again. So I can remove my list, as I can see here, or I could also remove just part of the list if I wanted. So, and now the storage is empty again. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So with that said, we are through with those examples here, and let's talk about some examples for entities. So the first two examples, or pretty much all of the examples, are copying from one entity to another. In this instance, from the player, which is in this case me, to the armor stand. So in this first example here, I'm copying the rotation. How do I do this? Well, I have data modify. The target is the armor stand on top of the command block here. Again, limit to 1. I'm targeting the rotation and I'm copying it from the nearest player, which is me. So let's do this and let's actually activate the hitboxes. And now you can see this armor stand is looking directly in the same direction as I am. So this might be useful, for example, with a teleport command in combination to make some kind of remote controlled drone. Very interesting stuff. Here, same command. This time I'm just copying the first entry in that list And you can see now it's only copying my horizontal orientation, but not my vertical orientation. Again, maybe interesting for a drone running in a two-dimensional maze or something like that. Next example, same idea. This time I'm copying the position and here entry number 2. So or the second entry, which is the y coordinates. And as you can see now, since this is still gravity affected, it starts to jump about, but yeah, just a slightly different example. And last example, this time for the scaling. Now, as you have noticed before, or might have noticed, the scaling only is accessible through the get mode. So here I had to tricks around a bit with the execute store command. I will cover that in a later episode, but for now, let's just say this is very similar to what I did in the previous commands here. I'm essentially just copying again the rotation first entry from the nearest player. This time with a scaling factor 6. And if I activate this one here, you can see for every rotation I do, this armor stand here does 6 full rotations. So if you want to, again, make a remote controlled drone and actually want to see where it's flying, even if you are directing it in the opposite direction, this might be a good idea. So anyway, these were just a few examples for what you can do with the data command. Obviously, there are many, many more options. But nevertheless, I think this is enough for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and well, see ya.